Welcome to Blowback. You're listening to another bonus episode of Season 5. This episode is an interview with former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, a Democrat who represented Brooklyn in the 1970s. She plays a small but essential role in this season's story. In 1973, when groups of activists and lawyers attempted to get the Nixon administration's bombing of Cambodia declared illegal, Holtzman was part of the campaign, and she also wrote Article 4 of the impeachment proceedings against Nixon, which concerned the Cambodia bombing, but were ultimately not adopted. In this interview, Representative Holtzman talked with me about this work, 50 years on from the scandal. Since leaving Congress in 1981, she subsequently served as Kings County DA and Comptroller for the City of New York, as well as being an attorney in private practice. And now, on to the interview. How did you get elected to Congress, and where did you serve in the early 1970s?
Well, I was elected to Congress in 1972, and somebody like me was never supposed to be elected because I wasn't personally rich. My family wasn't rich. I was a liberal Democrat. I was running against the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. He'd served in Congress for 50 years. He was an extremely powerful member of Congress. The Brooklyn Democratic machine was totally behind him. There were a variety of other races in New York City at that time, and the liberal community, the progressive community was involved in them. So mine was totally grassroots campaign, barely funded. We raised $32,000 and borrowed $4,000, and that's how we won primary, which was the equivalent of winning an election in Brooklyn. Nobody gave me a chance of winning at all. I was an outsider, a young person, and I was anti-war. I ran on an anti-war platform. That was key to my election to Congress.
Well, so you got elected in 1972, and I guess between the time when you would have won your primary and when you would have been, sworn in and starting your duties, right. More or less in that stretch, both Watergate emerged as the scandal that would ultimately fell the Nixon White House, but also the nature of America's conflict in Cambodia became public. Although America had we had launched the Cambodian invasion in 1970, the full truth of how we had gotten involved secretly through the secret bombings, Operation Menu, and so forth, that also became more public in early 73. So your position as an anti-war candidate, I guess, what did that mean once you got into office? Like, what could a freshman congressperson do to end the Vietnam War, and which was by then in Cambodia and Laos and so on?
Well, I was giving that a lot of thought because that was my mission. I told the people in my district that's why I was going to Congress. I wanted to represent them in ending the war. So I guess the first thing I did, this was really not a major statement, was Nixon was involved in what was called then the Christmas bombing of Vietnam, in which he bombed Hanoi. That was a gratuitous bombing. It was probably a war crime, and just focused on civilians. And at the very same time, Nixon invited, as was customary for any president, the newly elected members of Congress to the White House. And I refused to go. I was not going to shake his hand. And to me, that the bombing was just unconscionable. But then there were resolutions in Congress at the outset, in the Democratic caucus at the outset, against the war. Of course, I participated in that. But probably one of the most important things I did towards keeping my promise to my constituents was when I received a phone call from a lawyer who worked for the ACLU at that time in my congressional office. It was in the evening, and he said to me that he was bringing a lawsuit against the bombing of Cambodia, and would I join it as a plaintiff? And I said to myself, wow, this is an opportunity to stop the bombing in Cambodia. And we talked about the strategy of the lawsuit. And I said, well, why are you asking me? I was, thought, oh my goodness, he knows that I'm anti-war and he knows that I'm a, smart person. And I thought those would be the qualities. But he said, no, we need somebody from Brooklyn because we want to bring this lawsuit in the courts in Brooklyn. And that was very deflating to me because it had nothing to do with me. It had to do with geography. But in any case, it might have been the first time I used this whole set of the U.S. code that I got as a new member of Congress to look up the venue statute to make sure that he was right in bringing that he had authority to bring the case in Brooklyn. In any case, bringing the lawsuit in Brooklyn was a brilliant idea because the judge who got the case was somebody who had ruled in a case on the Vietnam War. And the judge had said, when he ruled that the war was constitutional, that Congress, because the Constitution requires that both Congress and the president be part of a war effort, Congress has to approve it. He said Congress has voted for appropriation after appropriation after appropriation, and Congress is complicit in approval of the war. So Bert said, well, Congress never approved any bombing of Cambodia. So if that's the standard, then we don't have congressional approval, and therefore the war is unconstitutional. So we're going to get before the same judge, and we're going to present the case to him. And I said, that sounds great, and I'm on board. And that's exactly what happened.
And how on board were the other Democrats in the party? I know that there was later on when it came to actually drawing up the articles of impeachment, there was some horse trading on this matter. And Richard Nixon had until late 1972 been one of the most popular presidents in modern history. So I imagine the politics of the moment were pretty fast moving and complicated.
Well, actually, the interesting thing was that my involvement in this lawsuit was only because of geography. Bert needed an anchor in Brooklyn. He needed a basis to bring the case in Brooklyn. So he didn't look beyond me. I mean, there were 5 members of Congress elected from Brooklyn, but he picked me, so I was happy with that. But I would say that the attitudes about the war were changing rapidly, and I'll never forget this, which is the first Democratic caucus that was held on the war in Vietnam, because the bombing was still going on in Vietnam. The war had not yet come to it. The war effort in Vietnam hadn't yet really come to an end. But we were sitting in a Democratic caucus to talk about, maybe even decide how the caucus as a whole would be voting. And I'll never forget that there was a member of Congress from Georgia. He was an elderly gentleman, and he got up to talk about his position. And he started off by saying how he had never abandoned his president when it came to making war. And he had supported Lyndon Johnson, and he had supported Nixon. But the people in his district were not for this war, and he had to vote against it. And tears were streaming down his face. And I saw at that moment that the war was in trouble in Congress. This was a Southern Democrat. Now that person probably would be a right-wing Republican. He was a very conservative member of Congress. He had supported the war, but he knew he couldn't do that anymore and stay elected in office. And tears were literally streaming down his face. So the support for the war was cracking in the Democratic Party.
And I guess one of the other things that's sort of related to that is the sense that Nixon personally was becoming politically imperiled over the course of 1973, even after the Paris Accords had been reached and announced in January 73. So, they officially make peace with North Vietnam, and then there's this 2-year, the so-called decent interval that follows. But in those first 6 to 7 months, Nixon in particular, sort of out of the dregs of the Vietnam War, you could say, because of how unpopular the war is, but also the growing Watergate scandal becomes kind of vulnerable.
Yes.
There's obviously, I think, people, I think, have drawn, when you look at the case of the Cambodian bombing and sort of integrating it into this, sort of, what became part of the impeachment proceedings, how did it sort of, even as the war became over, how did what was the basis for remaining so committed to dealing with Cambodia as part of this, increasingly heated up impeachment process?
Well, let me just say something. The impeachment process and Nixon's involvement in Watergate did not reach a head until middle of March, around that time, because what happened was the cover-up, the break-in in Watergate took place in June 1972. Just when I was running my primary in Brooklyn for Congress, Nixon's people broke into the Watergate complex and tried to place a wiretap there. Okay. That was covered up with a brilliant cover-up that was so successful. 5 burglars were caught and they were prosecuted, but the trial didn't take place till January, and they were being paid off, the burglars. They had been given promises of presidential pardons. They had been given money to keep quiet. Gerald Ford, who was the minority leader of the House of Representatives, had been enlisted to try to stop any subpoenas from being issued. So there was no serious investigation of Watergate. You had a complete cover-up. And it wasn't until the trial started in January of 73, and all of a sudden everybody's pleading guilty, and it looks like someone who was an operative for the CIA. It was part of this burglary team. It didn't seem like a normal burglary team.
And also
that began, and the judge said, I smell something fishy here, and imposed a stiff sentence. And then one of the burglars did not want to go to jail for 25 years, said, okay, there were higher ups involved. But until that wasn't known. And that's when things broke apart.
Right. So and that was when James McCord wrote the letter flipping in March, 73. That higher ups are involved. And that's when things broke open. And that's when you then had the Senate Judiciary Committee insisting on the appointment of a special prosecutor. So you had Archibald Cox then, and then you had the judge suggesting the Senate do something. So they formed a special Watergate committee. So then things started to unravel in terms of Watergate. But we didn't see it right away. But what was happening also, the anti-war sentiment, which I described just before with person crying on the floor of the House, the anti-war sentiment had taken hold because there was an appropriations bill that was percolating along, which had appropriations for the military activity, and there was an effort to cut off the funding for the bombing of Cambodia, and that did happen. Which is, and I was I was happy to vote for that as representing my constituents. That was another thing that I did. But that happened, and the interesting thing is that there were not enough votes. There were enough votes to carry the amendment, to get the amendment passed. Nixon said he was going to veto it. There were not enough votes to override his veto. So a compromise was worked out with Nixon that allowed the bombing to continue for 90 days. And it was
so basically what happened...
The end of, or like August 9th or something. Yeah,
right,
they
exactly.
set a firm deadline. And then,
So what I'm saying, though, is that anti-war sentiment had grown so substantially that Congress actually passed legislation, passed the House with a majority, passed the Senate with a majority, but they didn't have enough votes to override a veto. And so it established two principles. One is that Congress could stop a war when it wanted to, and did. That ended the bombing. I mean, Nixon was firmly opposed to it, but he saw that this was going to be a losing battle. And secondly, what it showed was that presidents can keep wars going with just a handful, a third of the vote plus one. They don't need a majority. You can have an anti-war majority, but a president can still keep a war going if the president has that 1/3 plus one vote. He can ignore the majority of Congress. He can ignore the majority of the American people. So it's kind of a mixed blessing, that vote.
So in one sense, Nixon was also, he was thumbing his nose at congressional authority, or Congress attempting to impose its authority. And at the same time, and that sort of can explain how it's one place where anti-war sentiment could emerge in Congress, or how you would inflame it. But what were the other things going on? I mean, theoretically, hadn't peace just been negotiated in Paris, and wasn't Kissinger the man of the moment, all these things? Why was anti-war sentiment still percolating by that late date in 1973?
Because the war was still going on, because the bombing was still going on, because Americans wanted that war over. It was an intense feeling. I mean, if this guy from Georgia, who had always voted for every single amendment and every single appropriation dealing with the war, in favor of the war, is crying and saying, I can't do it anymore, that tells you a lot. So what happened was an anti-war sentiment in the country forced the hand of Congress, and consequently forced the hand of the president. And that was a very, very important moment. And just as, and the anti-war sentiment was so strong. Remember what happened also just about at that time was that you had, in my lawsuit that I was a plaintiff in, the judge had ruled that the bombing of Cambodia was unconstitutional. That's going on at the same time. And it wasn't a moot issue. It was still going on. So the judge ruled.
And I was going to ask to that point, as the bombing is continuing, and, you've got both, I guess this lawsuit that you've now joined is winding its way through. What were the different parts of the lawsuit? Like the plaintiffs themselves, I know, like there had been soldiers, for example, or Air Force men who had been testifying before Congress in the summer of 1973. And you've talked, I've read some of your writings and some of oral history you gave, where you talked about having to really steep yourself in the constitutional law and the particulars of this process. But aside from, what may seem to sound like the dry legal stuff, what were the other parts of this lawsuit and sort of this emerging case, like the legal form that you were giving to this anti-war sentiment?
Well, the case is really important because it shows also the obstacles that an anti-war country can run into in terms of our institutions. So we started off bringing this lawsuit in Brooklyn because we knew that because of how the judge had positioned himself in terms of the arguments on the Vietnam War, that there's no way that he could support
Was this Judge Orrin Judd?
Orrin Judd. He was a Republican.
Yeah, I read. He seemed like a pretty interesting figure.
Right. He had said, he boxed himself in. He said, Congress had supported the war with appropriations, the war in Vietnam. So we said, well, Congress has said no to appropriations for Cambodia. So what's he going to say about that? At least we had somebody on record saying that Congress had to be involved, and they weren't involved in Cambodia. So here you have a Republican judge. Of course, the U.S. attorney in Brooklyn argued vehemently against our position, but the judge ruled in our favor. That could be the first time, and possibly even the only time, that a judge we have Justice Douglas, I'll get to that, but that's the only time that a district court judge ruled in favor of stopping the bombing, of stopping a war-making activity by the United States government, by the president. Then we go to once we won that case, of course, the Pentagon, the White House freaked out, and they appealed it immediately, and it went to the Second Circuit. That's the appellate court for the New York area. And in that case, there were 3 judges on the panel. One of those judges couldn't even sit still. He was popping up and walking out of the room. I don't think he heard any of the argument. Anyway, 2 of the judges were extremely conservative, and they found, they combed the law books to find every single argument they could to oppose and to oppose us and to overturn the district court judge, which they did. They overturned the district court judge, and there was one judge who voted in our favor. So it was a 2-1 decision. And then, of course, Bert, our lawyer, Bert Newborn, said, well, we're going to go to the Supreme Court. And, well, I was going to say that anyway. We have to go to the Supreme Court. So when you see, we wanted to stay the operation of the Second Circuit's decision, because that would leave the district court's decision in effect. And when you appeal to the Supreme Court, you have to go to the judge for a stay. You have to go to the judge that is assigned to your district. And the judge assigned to the Second Circuit, which is where Brooklyn is, was Justice Marshall. Well, everybody seemed to be pretty confident Justice Marshall was a hero. I've been involved in the civil rights movement. I've been in Georgia working for an African-American civil rights attorney. My view is that, oh my goodness, we're lucky. We have Justice Marshall. He's going to rule in our favor. This is a no-brainer. We're going to win this. And the lawyers go before Justice Marshall, and he refuses to grant a stay. Refuses to act in our favor. Under the rules of the Supreme Court at that time, if you were turned down in an application for a stay by one justice, you could go to all the rest of the justices of the court until you got a stay, or if they all denied it, you didn't get a stay. So our next target, if you will, was Justice Douglas. Justice Douglas, this was August or July. Justice Douglas came from the state of Washington, and the Supreme Court was in recess. They take a summer recess. And almost nobody was in Washington. And so we had to go out to the state of Washington, our lawyers did, to find Justice Douglas, serve him with the papers, and then see what happened. Well, I was getting calls from the state of Washington, and I was sitting in my office. It was 9 in the morning in Washington, or maybe it was 6 or 7 in the morning. Anyway, they were calling me from the state of Washington, the lawyer, saying, well, a hand has emerged from the door and picked up the newspaper. So he's inside. Anyway, we got progress reports. Finally, somebody had the courage to knock on the door. He took the papers, and he ordered a hearing the next day, I think, in the what served as a courthouse.
The local post office.
Yeah, the local post office. And Justice Douglas issued, I think, one of his finest decisions ever. And he basically said, this is like a capital case. If the bombing continues, people are going to die. Americans could die, Cambodians are going to die, but death is inevitable. And so in a capital case, we don't abide by this principle anymore, but it is the correct principle, and it used to be the principle that governed. In a capital case, you're going to have irrevocable injury, so you don't allow the injury to occur. You have a hearing on it. And he said, and there's a very good chance that we would win on the merits. So between the fact that continued bombing was going to cause death and there was a good chance of our winning, Justice Douglas stayed the Court of Appeals decision, the Second Circuit decision. That was a huge victory. Huge. Do you think the bombing stopped for 1 second? No. The Pentagon, the military paid no attention to the fact that you now had this Justice Douglas opinion saying that basically that the bombing had to come to a stop. What the government did, and I don't know that we have still all the information about that, the government, Nixon and his troops, so to speak, his minions, went back to Justice Marshall and said, you've got to undo what Justice Douglas did. Now, the rules of the court say that one justice cannot overrule another justice, which makes sense. But they ignored that rule, and since Justice Douglas had stayed the appellate court decision, Justice Marshall sort of avoided or paid no attention to the rule and the spirit of the Supreme Court rules and said, okay, I'm going to stop the district court decision. I'm going to enjoin that decision. I'm going to have an injunction against that decision. And that's what he did. He overruled Marshall. He stopped the district court's decision. And Justice Marshall, my hero on civil rights, became my anti-hero when it came to the war in Vietnam and the bombing of Cambodia.
I was about to ask that. Thurgood Marshall is probably like the last living, he was like the last, depending on one asks, but probably the last consensus judicial legend of the center and left in this country. And that's a pretty astonishing thing that he actively enjoined to stop the fellow justice's ruling to essentially halt the Cambodian bombing. What about Justice Marshall do you know now, or did you learn from this experience that made him do that?
I don't think we have a good answer. I think I don't know what the answer is. I think maybe he felt some allegiance to the war because Johnson had put him on the court and he was going to support the war that Johnson started. I don't really know. I can't fathom how a man who fought his whole life against discrimination in this country could not only turn a blind eye to it with regard to the bombing of Cambodia in another country, but was so eager to do that, to keep the war going when the Congress was against it, when the people were against it, that he was so intent on doing everything that he could to keep the war going that he violated, in my opinion, the Supreme Court's own rules on not overruling another justice. It was shocking to me and really disappointing. And I'll never forget this.
Please continue.
His son came up to me once on the floor of the House and told me how disappointed he was in what his father had done about that in that lawsuit.
One thing that occurs to me is that this is also a time when, even though the Vietnam War was extraordinarily unpopular and our government's policy in Indochina and anti-communist policy as part of the Cold War in general was unpopular, or at least hawkish Cold War policy, there still was a larger degree in those years. People had a kind of institutional deference to the military that is, both at once more present today and less present. People in those days, a larger proportion of Americans had served in the military and had, at the very least, it occupied a larger presence in their lives as it did in civic life. To what extent do you think that, part of why and I'm not trying to ask you to read Justice Marshall's in particular mind, but more just that I think when trying to summon why people may have stuck with this period, to what degree was it because it was a different time and people felt quite differently about the kind of authority that the military should retain with respect to the other powers of government?
I'm not persuaded about that because I just look at Congress and what Congress did vis-a-vis war at that time. One, Congress ended the bombing of Cambodia, ending basically U.S. military action in South Vietnam. In Vietnam and Cambodia. That was a big step, never happened before. Number two, we had, in addition to that, we had the war powers legislation that passed. Nixon vetoed that legislation. It was overridden by Congress. So we had war powers. The law has never been followed by any president. No president's ever going to allow Congress or the law to get in their way when it comes to doing any kind of military action, that no matter how ridiculous and stupid and horrific it is, they're never going to let the law get in their way, and they haven't. But that was passed also in the wake of the huge sentiment in this country against the war. Now, of course, when we get to impeachment, you'll see that the Republicans did not want to pass a resolution on war powers as part of the impeachment effort. But I'm just saying there was huge sentiment in the Congress, which meant there was huge sentiment in the country to end the war. And how Justice Marshall could have done what he did in that case, I don't understand it. It still becomes incomprehensible to me. And it's very sad.
And then when the case,
by the way, just a few days after, Justice Douglas turned out to be absolutely right. Just a few days after Marshall issued his decision, the U.S. mistakenly bombed a friendly Cambodian village, and 100 Cambodians who were pro-U.S. were bombed to death by the United States as a result of Marshall's decision and the continuation of that bombing.
And once the Marshall, I mean, that sort of is an immediate fine point on what Justice Marshall had ruled. But then, as you just were referring to, there was this what had begun as an impeachment process. There was this now, the crimes of the Nixon administration, which were not just limited to the Watergate burglary and were not just limited to the bombing of Cambodia, were also coming out more into view. It was the sense that the Nixon presidency, and also there was this ongoing standoff over the tapes, and that Nixon wasn't going to give them over. And a lot of what ended up preceding his downfall was his specific fight over those tapes and so on. But as the scandal, let's say, just for simplicity's sake, proceeded, how did your fight with, sort of fitting in Cambodia to the impeachment fight continue? I know that you worked with, for example, Representative the late John Conyers on trying to advance this. What was that struggle? How did it take shape, and what did it look like?
Well, we soon began to understand that Watergate was just a name used for the break-in at the Watergate complex of the hotel complex and into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. But that wasn't the beginning and the cover-up of that break-in by Nixon's campaign people. That wasn't everything that was involved in Watergate. That was just one part of presidential misconduct. And that's what was staggering. So as we went further and further into the impeachment, we discovered so many other things. We discovered, for example, that there was another break-in, not at the DNC, but into the medical office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, in order to get, this was orchestrated again by the plumbers in Nixon's White House, in an effort to get negative materials to smear Ellsberg. Ellsberg was on trial for stealing the Pentagon Papers. But Nixon ordered the same people who were involved in the Watergate break-in to break into the, I don't know that he ordered them, but he definitely approved of the break-in afterwards. They broke into the psychiatrist's office and tried to steal important papers or something that would frame or smear Ellsberg. So we discovered that kind of thing was happening. We discovered that there was wiretapping of journalists. In fact, the whole, what I would call modus operandi of the Nixon administration, which was wiretapping and surveillance, started with a leaked report that appeared on the front page of the New York Times announcing the secret bombing of Cambodia. That was in 1973. And the Nixon administration... Actually,
no, that was in 1969.
I'm sorry, 69, right?
Yeah. No, right. It's okay. These dates are soup. It's totally fine. You're totally right. The story by, I think, William Beecher.
Right. That was in March, I think, of 1969. Very early in his administration.
And it's a great example of how something can become public, but also still, in a kind of Schrodinger sense, like also be a secret still. Nixon and Kissinger and so forth, they acted even though it had been revealed, and then they went on this crazy, witch hunt or leak hunt, I guess, that became to characterize how they would solve all similar problems in the future. It also became, they still treated it as if it was secret. And the fact was, to almost all Americans, including many people in the know, once a year or two had gone by, they had forgotten all about operation menus being reported in the New York Times.
Correct. So what happened was, we saw that, and then you also had Nixon. What you began to see was a president out of control in his second term. He's going to dismantle a federal agency, the Office of Economic Opportunity. He's announced that he was going to withhold spending that Congress had approved. He didn't like the social programs, so he was going to stop spending. This is called impoundment. And then he claimed, of course, with regard to Cambodia and everything else, that he had the power to conduct war making without Congress. So you had a rogue president. He was undertaking surveillance activities of journalists. He was breaking in to political enemies. He was into offices related to political enemies. He was engaged in the cover-up in Watergate. He was tearing down federal agencies. He was refusing to spend money. This was a president who was out of control. And in that context, where you had a president out of control, the Cambodia bombing was central, in my opinion. You had a president who thumbed his nose at one of the central principles in the Constitution. The Constitution has a system of checks and balances, but it also understood, the framers understood, that two heads are better than one. That if you let a president do war making on his own, her own, that this could create a disaster for the country. That executives love to take countries to war, love to spend money, they didn't care about people dying. So they were happy to see, the framers were historians, and they were frightened of having a president engage in war making without a check. And so they put...
And so considering, considering that let's say that the constitutional case for is airtight here, that Nixon had, in addition to all of the other, broadly speaking, Watergate excesses and presidential misconduct, that in particular the Cambodia bombing case is a clear-cut example of the president abusing his authority in shutting out the Congress against what the framers of the Constitution laid out. Let's say that assuming that all that is true, Congress is still a place of politics. And part of what you were sort of confronted with was, even with the validity of this constitutional charge against Nixon, there were still many people in Congress who didn't necessarily want to see that added to the docket.
Absolutely. So what happened was, even though Congress had specifically said no bombing, no military activity in or around Cambodia, and the Congress had never supported any appropriations for Cambodia, the case, we don't have to assume that what the framers intended. It's crystal clear that was that the military activity by Nixon in bombing Cambodia was illegal, unconstitutional. And, in fact, Nixon kept two sets of books, just like the mafia in Brooklyn. One set of books was for the public, which showed no bombing in Cambodia. Another set of books were for the Pentagon and the insiders who knew exactly what was going on. But when it came to impeachment, I couldn't even get some Democrats to support an article of impeachment just on violating the Constitution. I had to water that down so that the violation was carrying out these activities without informing members of Congress, doing it in secret. In other words, violating not the principle of war powers, but violating the principle of informing Congress or getting Congress's assent. Well, I was ready to take what I could get on the impeachment. That was okay with me. I mean, it wasn't okay, but I wanted something. But in the end, that was not adopted. What happened was that I don't really know the inner workings of why some Democrats opposed this, but I think they did oppose it because there was a group of Republicans who were supporting the impeachment. And I think they did not want anything that seemed, quote unquote, political in the impeachment. And the war in Vietnam seemed very political, even though there were deep constitutional issues involved in it and implicated in it.
There's a lot of the historians mostly agree with you on that point, in that a lot of what seems to have structured the articles of impeachment and why the Cambodia part wasn't adopted was because of the fear that it would let out or would cause to alienate the bipartisan, because this impeachment as 73 becomes 74, as things go on, it became a bipartisan process at that point. There were enough Republicans opposed to the Nixon White House, and it was also just a different era. Things were less polarized. So I think your suspicions there were borne out. that was the reason why.
Right. I mean, for example, Chairman Rodino voted against my amendment proposing impeachment on the basis, which John Conyers, by the way, I gave the resolution to John Conyers to advance because he was much more senior than I. Said, what if I'm a brand new freshman member of Congress? They're not going to pay attention to it. So I asked John Conyers to introduce it. But Rodino voted against that amendment. Rodino was a very anti-war Democrat. He always voted against the war. So it really didn't have to do with the merits. It had to do with the politics of it. What Rodino understood and what many members of the committee understood was that the American people would not support an impeachment that was partisan. But if it was bipartisan, then they would be able to accept that this was not just a bunch of Democrats trying to undo Nixon's election, but this was something serious joined in by many Republicans, and that it therefore warranted attention and support. And they were right that the bipartisanship of it is what ultimately forced Nixon from office. So, but it's sad that that's what it took, and that even the Republicans who were courageous enough to support impeachment were not courageous enough to support impeachment on the grounds of one of the most serious violations of the Constitution that Nixon and abuses of power, which was the secret bombing, or the unconstitutional bombing of Cambodia.
Well, I think that also kind of brings me to the last couple sets of questions that I have. So, Nixon eventually is impeached, or rather, he resigns, heading off the conviction. Which
would definitely have been convicted. There's
correct.
No question about that.
So right, it was dead to rights.
Came out, they were holdout Republicans. We had the support of about 30% of the Republicans on the committee for impeachment. So the holdout Republicans said, well, there's not enough evidence. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously to release the tapes, the White House tapes that were made by Nixon himself. One of those tapes showed that he himself had ordered the cover-up by having his top aide call the CIA and tell them to get the FBI off the case. So stop the investigation. So with that evidence, Nixon's voice clearly heard, stopping the FBI. It was clear. So all the rest of the Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee, including the very conservative Republicans, said that they would support impeachment. Once you had a unanimous House Judiciary Committee supporting impeachment, there's no way that was going to fly. There's no way that Nixon could survive that. And the televising of those hearings also persuaded the American people of the sincerity and legitimacy of the process. So he wasn't going to survive that, and that's why he resigned.
And then afterwards, as you were just sort of saying, though, like the Republicans couldn't kind of square up the courage to say to their constituents, for example, like, or maybe these politicians themselves didn't believe it in their heart of hearts that what we had done in Cambodia was this, grave, or what Nixon had done was this grave violation of principle about which we should be concerned for the future. Yes, there had been the passage of the War Powers Act and so on, but it struck me that, as the 70s went on, and also as the blame and the interest for a lot of this stuff widened from Nixon. I mean, you had the Pike and Rockefeller committees, and it's the House Select Committee on the assassinations, and gradually, like it becomes less just about Nixon. Do you think that the American people were given, given a real portrait of just how much to blame the American military and the American White House had been in, prolonging an unnecessary tragedy, to put it in the simplest way?
Well, I mean, yes, the impeachment should have included it. The people should have the American people should have been given more information about what happened in Cambodia, the lies that were told. Remember, the military activity is not something that only destroys foreign territories, foreign lives, foreign operations, but Americans are at risk from that. I mean, that's one of the reasons that these pilots had joined in the anti-bombing lawsuit, because they said, we're flying from Guam, we're flying for hours, we could be shot down for an unconstitutional action by the president. They didn't want to die for nothing. And so, and that's still something we have to be concerned about, not only in these days, not just the military activity by ourselves, but military activities that we support or condone or are complicit in by providing weapons and the like. So these are things that Americans need to understand, that we can play a big role both in war and in peace. And Americans played a huge role in stopping the war, but they didn't really realize, I think, the extent to which Nixon wanted to carry on military activity.
And then
in Cambodia.
In later interviews, you've said something that I actually agree with completely about the nature of the Iraq War, and a little bit more about how kind of the full stop lie that entire war was. And just sort of like, one of the things that struck me about it, though, is that, there was a difference in how Vietnam carried on and how the secret activities in Cambodia were launched, and for how the Iraq War was launched, which was, there were lies told, yes, but it was a case made to the public. You could compare it to Tonkin and things of that in the Johnson years, but I was sort of struck by, how 30 some odd years later, different kinds, different natures, yes, but there was still this, the government proves incredibly capable of deceiving people when it wants to carry out a war. And, we live with proof of that pretty much every day. I guess, is there, do you see a line, was there something hinted at, or was there a failure of how, what happened in the 1970s that is, sort of led to this? Do you think of that as a pivotal moment in sort of setting us on this course?
Yes, I think that the failure to hold a president accountable for war-making abuses, for unconstitutional actions that result in war, the failure to hold a president accountable for that, Nixon namely, gave us the Iraq War. And who knows what else it will give us. The failure to hold presidents accountable, the looking past their crimes, their abuses of power, their ignoring the limits of their power, endangers all of us. That's Congress's, the framers had kind of idealistic view of the world. That, well, both very realistic. They knew that there'd be bad people. They knew that people would abuse power. They knew that people in office were not to be trusted. That's why they created a system of checks and balances. But sometimes when those systems of checks and balances don't work, when Congress turns away from its responsibility to hold a president accountable, when the Supreme Court turns aside from its responsibility to hold presidents accountable, then we're in trouble. Because as the framers knew, you cannot rely necessarily on any institution to do the right thing. We've all got to be part of trying to make the system, our democracy work. And the American people are a key part to that, which means they've got to make themselves informed. Sometimes, they've got to look past what a president says. Nixon taught us that presidents could lie, but when it came to the Iraq War, people still believe what the president said, even though what George Bush said about the war, that, Saddam Hussein had these weapons of mass destruction, that he was in cahoots with Al-Qaeda. It was an orchestrated effort to get us involved in that war, and we're still paying a price for it.